Hi. Oh, what a trip. Put some stuff online and you make a video and you use some words and string them together and all of a sudden there's a couple hundred people in a room. The breathing helps us come together and settle into the same space. And something I want you to reflect on before we get into it is you can go maybe a week without food. You could go quite a few days without sleep, I know. You can go a few days without water. You can't go very long without breathing though, can you? It's really closely intertwined into our existence for a very specific reason. It's not just a fluke. I mean, there's reasons why we have to eat a certain amount every day. Cycles happen for very specific reasons. It's not by accident. And then you think, you can't go very long without breathing. How long can you go without your heart beating? Like, wow, how closely is that connected to it all? And then breathing through the heart. I had no idea what that meant until recently. 12 months ago, I lived in this building. Not by choice. We just ran out of money, we couldn't pay rent at home. And Gilly here was kind enough to let me and Bravo live in our office for about 4 months while we planned New Kind Festival. So we'd work day and night and sleep on our yoga mats in our office for a few hours and then wake up again in the morning and get back to work. Efficient, right? And some days we wouldn't have money to buy groceries, so we just have to make do with what we had. And other days we didn't even have money to buy coffee, but we'd still keep working because we had computers and Wi-Fi and a shelter and enough food in the pantry to last a day or two. And for me, that's what resilience means. And I spent a few hours the other night. I wasn't expecting quite so many of you to show up, so I created a 15-question questionnaire for you to fill out, thinking maybe 60, 100 people might show up. But I ended up having to read 200 and something odd questionnaires the other night. And it was intense. The courage and the bravery, the tenacity that was in these responses brought me to tears on several occasions. But something that stuck out for me was this idea that resilience was somehow connected with toughness. A few people mentioned bringing what they would like is to grow some balls. I'm like, balls are actually really delicate and soft. You don't want balls. I mean, right, vaginas, right? Vaginas literally bring human beings into the world. So if you want to talk about toughness, we should talk about vaginas. But But even having said that, resilience is not even about that. Because if you are tough, if you harden up, you will get broken. You will be snapped. I mean, it's the branch that sways in the wind, and it's okay to be pushed around that lasts, and the branch that dies and dries up is the one that falls. So resilience for me is actually surrender. It's the ability to be able to receive, witness, experience without hardening, without breaking, without becoming twisted, warped, bitter, broken. There is something that needs to break, and we'll get to that later. But truly, the most powerful thing, if we can call it a thing, is the most vulnerable thing. It's also the thing that's most susceptible to surrender. It's Mother Nature. Nature will outlast all of us because she is able to surrender, to rejuvenate, to allow itself to be vulnerable and allow human beings with consciousness to do as they will and make the space in in a very short period, make the space uninhabitable, basically. But she will last because she's able to receive and transmute. And the key to actually being able to fulfill the purpose of our existence is just that. Transmutation. Like alchemists have for thousands of years been trying to turn copper into gold, because that's how limited our mindset was back then. But if we can take pain and hurt and suffering and fear and receive it and return kindness and compassion and love, I mean, what greater power could there be on this earth, in this universe, to transmute that? The highest. That is why we actually exist. Which is why resilience is important for me, because it's part surrender, it's part transmutation, it's part the ability to continue going through life without feeling like we need to tense or harden or cut ourselves off. The root cause of all suffering is separation, dissonance, disunity. Anything that's separate, anything that fails to recognize wholeness. And the most powerful healing tool is the understanding of oneness, connectedness, unity. And this is why it's important to not harden. This is why it's important to be truthful and to share realities. Because when we are connected, when we don't close ourselves off because of things that have happened to us that have hurt us, we remain alive, and we actually have a greater capacity to comprehend life, because things make sense. When you shut yourself off because of a blow, a trauma, a suffering, things don't make sense anymore. It's like taking a gear out of a watch or a clock and looking at that and trying to understand what the point of that thing even is. It has no point unless it's in a system, unless it's in a clock or a watch or a car. A piston makes no sense. When you understand the totality of it and you realize it is all connected, as separate as it might seem, that other person, this whole existence, then it begins to make sense. So for me, there are many, many reasons why this idea of resilience and emotional core strength is probably one of the root actions for social change. I grew up in a family that was committed to community development, and my father was using theatre for social change back in India as a refugee from Iran. He wasn't even Indian. And as an art student, he would use theatre in a language he had just learnt to teach ideas of, the equality of men and women and respect and universal oneness of mankind through theatre, because that's what illiterate villagers in India would like to receive. They can't read posters. And then I was born, and he met my mum, and I was born, and we came to Australia. My entire life has been basically involved with community development, social change, youth work, watching my father at first, and then as a teenager getting involved voluntarily, until eventually I was working in it without really having studied it, until eventually I did my master's in communication for social change. All along I studied engineering, I was married and divorced, I ran a successful business, and what else? I ran festivals, that's right. And eventually, when I did that master's, a lot of things started making sense to me. And I realized that much of community development, much of social change work, was actually seeing to the symptoms, the wounded. We were helping those who have been damaged, or those who have been hurt, or those who have been affected financially, emotionally, whatever, by the world that we exist in. And we weren't ever addressing the root cause. Like, we know we've got domestic violence in our homes. We know how many women are being beaten to death in their own homes every year in this country alone. And we talk about that, but we don't go, why? We know who did it. What's going on there? I mean, we know how many people are committing suicide every year in their own homes. But why? What's going on there? We know we've got a drug and alcohol issue in our society, and there's violence because of drugs and alcohol, particularly alcohol in nightlife. But why are they drinking so much? Like, it's really simple. If we can stem the blood flow and have rehab centers and homeless shelters and domestic violence support networks. But I wanted to get to the core. So after I left my master's, I started writing really terrible poetry to begin with. And eventually it got better, and I became, a spoken word artist. I'd write poems and go further and further into philosophy rather than just talking about what was going on in my life. I delved deeper and deeper using my background in community development and kind of like a poetic, adventurous kind of idea. I went into these themes, and I realized all of our efforts will be futile if we don't get to the root cause of what's actually going on. And then I realized that the very center of the universe rests within your chest, behind your ribcage. And you can feel it. And when it's cracked open, it's super sensitive and it's always there. That there is the epicenter of your existence. Your entire universe stems from there. We have results. One step back, we have actions. One step back, we have intentions. And on a deeper level, we have motivations. And everything we do in our life, whether it's a particular piece of artwork, or whether it's an entire life career, a life path, or the family that we create or refuse to create, it's an epic art piece, all of it. And how you go about it, the actions that are involved in making that happen, are irrelevant almost. It's the motivation behind your intention that needs to be addressed. Later on, I will discuss the idea of God and what God means to me and why it's important to hold a concept even if we're not really religious. Just believing in that concept gives us a tool, regardless of what faith or if you have or don't have. But this universe, this natural world, works in complete and perfect harmony. Everything from the capillaries in your body to the veins in the leaves to the way water recycles itself, everything, the seasons, the solar systems, it works in perfect unity because it was an expression of pure love. There was no hurt, there was no fear, there was no angst, there was no anxiety. It was just an expression of pure love that separated everything from everything in that Big Bang. And it all panned out perfectly. So if we want to work out why the social structures and the systems we have in place, whether they be economic, whether they be the way we feed ourselves, the way we package our food, the way we treat our animals even, the way we use drugs and alcohol, if we want to get to the root cause of all of that, we should look at the motivation inside and what's going on in the heart. And how much of that is love and how much of that is fear? Where's the balance? And how much more fear can we clean out so that we don't need to worry about how I'm going to make ends meet or how I'm actually going to change the world or how I'm going to live a fulfilling life. Like the actions become irrelevant when your motivation becomes clear. Some of you will know, most of you won't know, that when I get up in front of an audience, my preparation is to empty myself of myself, and I freestyle every seminar that I do. If I was to give you a speech, it would mean nothing. If I had an hour-long talk that I had memorized, and I failed to take into consideration who was actually going to be here, and the energy of the room, and the reactions to what I was receiving, it would mean nothing to you. Right. So instead, I get out of my own way, and what comes out as a result is just my intention. The words will come themselves. My rehearsal is my life, my day-to-day life, how I conduct myself, what I think about at night, how I treat people in the streets. That's my rehearsal. That's me preparing myself to be honest in front of an audience like this. And that's where a few people mentioned stage presence was why they were here. That's where stage presence comes from. When you really, truly believe in what you're saying or what you're presenting, even if it's an art form, even if it's just theater, if you truly believe that there is a message that needs to be heard, then you'll be comfortable on that stage. If you have a talk to give at university or at work or whatever it might be, even a wedding speech, if you just tune in to how you're feeling and speak honestly, you won't be nervous. Nerves and anxiety come, again, from separation, from dissonance, from disunity. When there is something that's not perfectly aligned, there is nerves, there is fear, there is anxiety. Which is why this idea of truthfulness is really important to me. For me, it's like the base of everything, and it connects up to many things. It's not just how we speak, but how we live as well. So to speak truthfully is to say the full truth, of course, we know that. And when we don't, there is a dissonance there between the actual fact of reality and what you've just said. So you've created a separate reality in someone else's head that's actually not true. And that will cause you anxiety. And it will come across in the way you say it. Someone who's really present with you will know when you're lying. We all do, in fact. Whether it's a partner who's lying to our face, whether it's our parents, whether it's a friend, whether it's someone who's not being perfectly authentic with us, we'll know it. It's just a matter of whether we want to accept it or not. So that's that dissonance, because we're looking at their face, we can feel their energy, and when the words come out and they're not aligned with their energy, we're like, nice one, bro. And as much as someone might want to pretend that they don't really think you're lying, they know at a base level, they know that. And they'll remember that. And they'll interact with you in such a way. And if you continue to just give tiny little white lies every now and then, and just 90% truths, that person will know that at their core. And they'll treat you in such a way. And they'll always know that. So speaking truthfully is good for stage presence, for strong relationships with other people. But it's also really important for your own sense of self-worth, your own self-respect, and your own conviction in what you're going to do. Because if you know that you always do what you say you're going to do, and you always say exactly how you're feeling, then when you set a task for yourself, you know you're going to do it, because you always follow through with doing what you say you're going to do. And it begins with small tasks, and eventually gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. But if you start saying things, or saying you believe in certain things, but you don't actually follow through with them, there's something still there that needs to be taken out of the way. There's a dissonance still there. And it's not easy to see, because it's within you. You're a fish in the ocean looking for water sometimes. And I don't imagine that anybody here would ever do the things that happen in an abattoir, or a dairy farm, or an egg-laying farm, to an animal. We never would. If you ever saw someone treat a pig, a cow, a lamb, a chicken, the way they are treated, you would never allow that to happen, ever. And on some level, we are aware of what's going on. We don't know the full extent of it. We don't know, they're literally cutting cancers out of pork before they serve it to us. That's what the butcher does. We don't know exactly how many chickens are crammed into those cages that are called free range. We don't know how horrendously those pigs are being kicked in their head when they're squirming. We don't know the details of it, but we do know they're being mistreated. At the very least, we know that animals are being slaughtered for us to eat because they taste good. And knowing that, but continuing to do it, does no harm to me. And the animals will forgive you, and the universe will continue, and nature will progress. The main thing that you should be concerned about is your own sense of self-worth, integrity, and living truthfully. If you don't care if someone kicks a dog in the head or kicks a pig in the head, then it's okay, because you're not causing yourself dissonance. If you don't care that people eat dogs in China, then that's okay. Eat pork in Australia. Because that won't cause you mental confusion or dissonance, and you'll be at peace with the fact that you're eating meat. But if that bothers you, then on some level, that's within you. That's just one example of saying we believe in one thing, but actually not living in perfect alignment with it. We don't want trees to get cut down, for example, in the Tarkine, or any ancient rainforest. We really don't want that. And people literally chain themselves to trees to stop these trees being cut down. But those very same people use takeaway coffee cups and napkins that are paper instead of carrying a handkerchief and a keep cup. That's dissonance again. So it's really difficult to find sometimes, and it's painful to look at as well when we finally do pinpoint it. And that's what I mean by truthfulness and living truthfully. When we begin to address that, we begin to find our integrity. And the more truth we live, the more truth we're actually capable of witnessing. And it doesn't end. There's no limit to the truth yet to be witnessed in this universe. And it all comes with further connectedness. It all comes with expanding further and further out. So the workings of this universe make more and more sense. Something that's kind of related to the treatment of animals is that it's lack of awareness that actually causes us to cause each other harm. And I know there's some really obvious examples out there of people who are like really messed up and caused a great deal of trauma to individuals in this world or millions of people in this world. But for some reason, I still hold this belief that they justify it in their head as though they are doing good. No one inherently believes they're doing evil. They think what they're doing is just. Whether it's like white supremacy, racial cleansing, racism, they believe it. And it's their lack of awareness that allows them to believe that. They haven't seen the full picture, they don't see the connectedness, and they believe this. But as we increase our awareness, we get to see our old mistakes. And we become more and more aware of what we're doing and how that's causing someone else harm, and how we should be more delicate with our words, and how, you know, the idea of affirmative consent and radical consent, in fact, it's not really radical, really, it's just affirmative consent, is so important, and what that really means, and how if we're not practicing affirmative consent, then we're actually reinforcing rape culture. And these are things that we can get worked up about right now, but we also have to be aware that a generation or two ago, the awareness wasn't there. So we can't like really be angry about that. All we've got to do is be present with where we're at right now. I'm like, cool, okay, they didn't have that awareness anymore, that back then, we do have it now. And we can act in such a way that removes more fear, more hurt, more trauma out of this world. What happens when we are hurt, emotionally and physically, is our senses diminish all of a sudden. Literally, our field of vision closes in. If you're suffering heartache even, the world like goes from that to like that. And it becomes black and white sometimes too, grey tone, when you're really hurting. You're not really aware. You often don't look up very often either. Your gaze is like there. A lot of the time it's down here, because looking up is painful. And it's not just physically, emotionally, like emotional intelligence-wise, we're also diminished in our senses, and we're not sensitive to other people around us when we're feeling hurt. So this ability to be able to take a blow and to not feel trauma, even though there is hurt being done, to not be affected by it allows you to remain in your full senses. And anyone who's studied the philosophy of any martial art will know that when you're calm and centered and grounded, you're best able to actually defend yourself. If you get flustered and confused and nervous, you're actually going to get smacked a fair bit more. Emotionally, it's the same thing. If we're able to remain calm when someone spits harsh words at us, then we're actually better able to navigate that space and not hurt them as well, or anyone else around us, or potentially take that hurt from the workplace or any other environment and then unleash it on someone else. And how we can do this is to understand that we, as the human being, aren't just the body. We're not just the ego. We are also the consciousness that animates the body and uses the mind. The next time you feel hurt by someone's words, or by a memory of a past lover, or by a family member, I want you to sit with that hurt and locate it and find, like, who is it that actually is hurt? Because you are greater than your ego. The ego is the protective shell around the seed. But within it is what's actually important. So the ego is very much fear-based. It's reactive. And it responds to fear stimuli because it was like as thousands of years that we needed to be able to like actually live through that period to that eventually our brains developed into the capacity that we now have them at. And we had to like not fall off of cliffs and not burn ourselves to death and run away from animals that were likely to kill us. But part of civilization, growing through adolescence, which is what we're doing actually as a civilization, part of that is to recognize that that tool that helped us back then is actually hindering us now. Fear. And the ego is what responds to fear. So when someone spits harsh words at us, whether they call us names, whether it's a racist slur, whether they hail Hitler at you, which I had happen to me back here, the part of me that would potentially be hurt from that is the ego self that identifies with a particular story that we've crafted. And I want us to reflect on this idea of state versus story and how they're very different. This story is this thing that we construct in our minds. Because the world is changing so rapidly, everything is in flux, everything is changing, we aren't really in control of much at all. We'd like to think we are. There's books like The Secret that tell you can manifest whatever you want, but it's actually a rot. You can have an influence on your life, and you have influence on your perspective and how you deal with life, but you can't manifest a yacht out of nothingness. You have very little control in the physical realm. First and foremost, we have to have control over our own emotions. Like, until we can do that, like, how are we meant to like affect weather patterns? Which we can do. But our emotions is what we need to first have control over. Where was I going with that? Back 2 steps. Ego. State versus story, thank you. So the story is what we do have control over. Thank you. So, as a response to the uncertainty and the flux of life and the anxiety, we create this meticulously crafted story of our existence. And our memories are just like a fraction of what actually happened. And they fade and they become twisted and thwarted as well, and they're not actually true. Like what we remember happened to us 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago as children, our family environment, it's not actually true. Things happened, I know, but our memory of it, very different. I remember this, I realized this when my grandfather passed and my dad's brothers and sisters all came together. And I'd heard all these stories from my dad about how his dad had treated him and how he'd call him names and how he would say if I'd raised a donkey, he would have been a professor by now and you'll never really amount to much at all. And my dad wanted to be the president of the United States, and my grandfather would just constantly put him down and make fun of him. So I had this image of my granddad. I'm like, wow, granddad was a bit of a prick. And then his brothers and sisters came together in Canberra for the funeral. And I heard my auntie from Brazil's reactions and her stories about how she remembered their childhood. And now my uncle from Africa was here, and I heard his stories of how he... And I realized, wow, they've all got really different stories about their father that they've reinforced over 50-odd years. And now at the age of 60-something, there's these 7 different unique ideas of what their father was. And it just goes to prove that how we remember what happened to us is just something that goes through the filters that we have in place, and we reinforce the very little that we do remember, and we somehow convince ourselves that it's fact, and that becomes our one thing that we actually do have control over. Like, if I can't control what's going on out there, at least I can control how my story was written, my identity, my ego. That is true, and that I have control over. And that's why these things become really important. And that's why when someone questions that or throws something at that identity, that ego is hurt, because it's the one thing that we really relate to. But when we become okay with the flux of life and the uncertainty and constant evolution and change and growth and and the fact that we don't know where we've come from, we don't know where we're going, we don't know what we're meant to be doing here, when we become okay with that uncertainty and we actually surrender, we're able to slowly unravel that ego story and come back to state. And in the present state, almost the entirety of your life, you will be safe, you will be secure, you will be loved, you will be welcome, you will be smiled at. The overwhelming majority of our life. And that's why it's really important to let go of these stories that we've crafted, because A, they're not true, and B, they're causing us to not really be able to be present with life and to experience it for what it truly, really is. An amazing artist, a painter, can paint a landscape from taking one simple glance at it because they're present with that space. And in a quick glance, oh yeah, I got that. And they see everything. They go back to their studio, and because of their ability to be fully present in that moment, they can go back and recreate that in the studio. But if you're actually like suffering from trauma or hurt or thinking about your ex-girlfriend or your dad or whatever, you can look at the landscape and not remember anything. You go back to the studio, it'll be an impressionist thing. You'll be like, yeah, it's something like that. So we're missing out on a great deal of life by identifying with story, by feeling hurt, and by allowing our ego to somehow be related to like who we actually are. The fact of the matter is, one of the mechanisms for overcoming trauma is disassociation. Like step out of the self for a second. And when it's enforced, like when it happens by force, it's not healthy, it's not great. You know what I mean? Someone can go through a severe traumatic experience and that's post-traumatic stress. We disassociate with the self. Whether it's rape or whether it's having gone through war or childhood abuse, whatever it might be. And that needs healing, that needs grief counseling, that needs work that I am not capable, I'm not qualified to do. But what I can tell you is that that same level of disassociation, when enacted at will by the self, is actually how to deal with anything that's thrown at you in life. If you can do it in a split second, and instantly remind yourself that even though 5 minutes ago I was telling someone what happened to me last week and that was my story, if in an instant you can be like, hang on, something just happened, someone just walked past and yelled something at me. If you can be like, oh, I'm not actually my story, I'm not my ego, and you can actually witness yourself. And at the first, when you start doing this, you'll still respond, it's natural. You're still going to be hurt and you'll get worked up and you feel your heart tense up. And if you're present with it, you'll notice how everything tensed up. Your heart will tense, your breath will shorten. But at least you witnessed it. If you try, you'll begin witnessing it. And just like actual physical core strength, emotional core strength takes working out. Like the more you lift, the bigger you get physically. And it's the same thing. It takes exerted effort. It doesn't just happen. I can't just be like, oh yeah, try this ticks and trips and ticks and blah, 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 and you'll be fine. It actually takes physical exertion, takes emotional exertion to witness something, feel the hurt, recognize that it's unjustified, and let it go. And it might take a few moments to calm down. And it'll come up again. But the more you do it, the better you get at it. Eventually you get to a point when someone can throw whatever they want at you, or life can throw whatever it wants at you, and you'll be able to remain calm and composed and compassionate towards the person or towards life. Meditation and prayer. These are two things that are really, really important, regardless of whether you have a system of faith or not. It doesn't matter what it is. Meditation, because it brings you back to state, and you forget about story. And when you can do that for 20 minutes, half an hour, you practice that meditation, you get good with disassociating with the story. And that's basically what you're doing. When life throws something at you, you're rehearsing to enter a meditative state in a split second. So it's not just about meditating in the mornings for an hour, in the evenings for an hour, and forgetting that. You're actually meant to try and do that throughout the day when it's needed. Because when you're in your own home, in your prayer room, it's lovely, but it's not of no use unless you can enact it in day-to-day life. And when you begin doing that, when you become present with life, and you notice those moments where you feel something, and you can take yourself out of the ego self and enter your soul state, that's like entering a meditative state. And the more you do it, the easier it becomes, the longer those periods become, and eventually there'll be more meditative state than non-meditative state until one day it connects up. And you exist purely in that state. And I'm sure most of you will know someone who you believe to be living in that state. Whether it's the Buddha or whether it's Eckhart Tolle or whoever your God or guru might be. There's people who seem like they've entered some sort of heightened state of awareness, and they also might come out of it. And I assure you they will. It's hard to remain calm when someone slaps you physically in the face, but you can do it, even just to prove to yourself that you can do it. So the point is to eventually get to a place where we live in that meditative state and we become the witness of life and of existence. And we're no longer the seed. You see, birth and death are not two separate things. They're one and the same thing in the same instant. Like at the same time, a birth is a death. It just depends on which side of it you're standing on. So the child that comes out of the womb into this world is dying and being born at the same time. It's dying to its entire universe. Everything it held to be true, everything it's ever known, just collapsed and disappeared in an instant. It died. And it was born into another world. And here we call it birth because it just came into our world. And on the other end, when someone passes from this realm, because we're here, we think of it as a death, but they're actually being born as well. So birth and death are the same thing in the same moment. And to understand that, you kind of need to look at the seed. And when you work with growing your own food for a little while, there's so many things that you learn from this process. And one of these things was that idea that, like, where did the seed go that became the tree? Like, where is it? It had to break itself open and die, but it didn't die. It became a tree. And that ego shell that I was talking about is the covering of the seed. But your true essence lies once you crack that ego open. Now to prayer. There are certain conversations we cannot have with anyone, with anything, even with our own self, unless we hold this idea that there is an observer of our existence. That's all you have to think about. Forget everything that we've ever been told of God, because they've all been the imaginings of someone else, and they're all imperfect. They're all just someone else's idea, and anyone's idea is as good as your idea. So put that all aside. All you need to consider is there a witness to my existence? Someone who I don't need to explain anything to, ever, and has seen and felt everything I've seen, and felt everything I've felt, and knows every suffering that I've gone through, and every bit of litter that I picked up, and every bug that I saved, and every moment that I wanted to lash out and I didn't lash out. Believing in that allows you to have conversations that you can't have with anyone else, ever, no matter how long you spend in a life in a partnership with someone. And that's all I ask of you. Knowing that someone is witnessing you so that you can have those conversations is one of the things that has saved me many times. And I assure you, at first, if you don't believe in that idea, you just have to go through, just like smiling actually releases the same chemicals as if you're actually smiling. Go through the process. Just do it. Have the conversation. You're like, this is bullshit, whatever. And then you just start talking as if someone's there, and then I assure you, you will feel that presence descend upon you. And you will cry. And you will weep. And you will let go of so many things that you've been carrying for so many years. And you will forgive yourself, and you will forgive others, and you will forgive existence. So I urge you, regardless of your system of faith, to meditate regularly until it all connects up into one full cycle, and you never leave that space. Or get as close to it as you can. And have those conversations with your witness on a daily basis if you can. So we've covered truthfulness, we've covered prayer, meditation, ego, shells, trees, birth, death, transmutation, art. Let's go to art. There was a time when art was just something we did. It was part of our daily practice. We would dance, and we would sing, and we would paint, and we would make pottery, and we would inscribe it with artwork on top of it, and we would express freely because we had the time to. And then something happened, and we had this industrial revolution or whatever. I mean, it started a bit before that. And art became something we did as a hobby, separate to our actual existence. And then it became commodified, and then it became prostituted, where we practice it to make a living out of it. And if it's not making a living, then it's not worth anything. Therefore, we stop doing it and we go to do something that makes us a living. Using the arts to make a living breaks my heart. I mean, if you can make a living from it, fantastic. Like if people like what you're doing. But if that's the point of what you're doing, then your art's usually not going to be very good. And B, you're failing to fulfill the purpose of what it was for. But the most damaging thing that this idea has done to us is that the vast majority of us no longer practice any art form. Not even one. Because of, I don't have time to. I've got to work to make a living and whatnot. The breath thing that I was speaking about earlier. There's a reason for these cycles. There's a flow, flux, recycling. Art is the same thing. It's an expression that has to come, and it doesn't need to be seen by anyone else, really. The fact that some people like a particular piece of art that you've done or don't like, it's irrelevant. If they like it, it generally resonates with something that they've been willing to, they've been feeling as well, and then wanting to express, and they haven't, and that resonates with them. But no one really needs to see it. We need to practice art so we can express and get out all those things that breathing hasn't gotten out for us, and conversation hasn't gotten out for us, and exercise hasn't gotten out for us. There's still things left. And the really good stuff is at the bottom of the barrel. The art. That's where that comes out. So you breathe to keep yourself calm, and you exercise to keep yourself fit, and that also lets out some of the energy. But the really good stuff is when you start practicing art, poetry, dance, just for the sake of dance. Play. Drawing, sketching. It allows things to come out in a way that can't come out any other way. Each of the mediums allows certain things to come out, which is why it's really important to do all of them whenever you get a chance. To dance, to draw, to sing, to paint, to write. All of them. Theatre, on the streets, at home, skits with the kids, whatever. All of them allow us to get out certain things. And for us to discuss ideas that we couldn't bring up. Comedy allows us to talk about so many things that we can't talk about directly. People don't want to be taught. They want to be made to laugh, and then eventually they realize themselves, like, oh yeah, eating animals is pretty fucking weird, isn't it? Like, if you can make people laugh about it, like, who was the first person who said, I'm going to eat the next thing that comes out of that chicken's bum? Like, someone thought that. And then we've been doing it ever since. So there's things that these art forms can do that we can't do with just straight up talking. It helps us get it out of ourselves and refresh the system. It also helps us to share ideas with other people. And it helps us to feel connected. When a song that someone else has sung, when I listen to a Bon Iver song and I can feel what he's saying in that song, and it just breaks me, and I feel like someone else has felt, I'm feeling this thing that someone else has also felt, and I'm not alone, and that's connecting. And you can see it in paintings, you can see it in poetry. How many suicides has poetry averted? My own, at least 3 or 4 times. And then there comes the idea of the process. Just like rehearsing a cover drive or a late cut over and over and again. You memorize that. So when you need to, at will, you can play that stroke. Art allows us to memorize those ideals and those principles and those things that we believe in, which is one of the reasons why I don't listen to heartbreaking music a lot anymore. But I try and listen to enlightening music, or uplifting music, or I read things that make me feel better, even though, sure, it's nice to read a dark mystery novel every now and then, but if you keep reading that, you're memorizing that. But more so, if you're writing that, You're memorizing that. So your art form is a way of you embodying your expression and practicing it and memorizing it, because we all know the truth. Like on a deep individual level, the reason why we say truth resonates, do we know what resonating means? It's like two wavelengths that are exactly the same, so when they meet, they actually double their amplitude because they're exactly the same wavelength. So when you resonate with the truth, or you say you resonate with the truth, it's because that truth was already existing and you already knew it, and when you meet that truth or you hear it, you're like, that's why it feels familiar, right? So we all know the truth. And when we're calm and composed and in a meditative state, we are kind and we are generous and we are all of these attributes and virtues. But we forget them in the hustle and bustle of life. And our virtues go out the window, our manners go out the window, our noble intentions go out the window. But when we practice art, whether it's drama or music or poetry, and we write it down, we rehearse it, and we perform it in front of audiences, we memorize those ideals and those principles, and it becomes part of the very fabric of our being. And then we don't have to think about it anymore. We just transform ourselves without having to reach for it. All those things that make us noble and compassionate and kind and generous are always at our fingertips. So I urge you, if you're not already practicing a couple of forms of art, to do so. And if you're doing 2 or 3, find another one. I often find people ask me, find another one, and another one. Is it DJ Khalid? And another one. The best way to get over creative blocks is to put aside the art forms that you're comfortable with, the 2 of them that you're comfortable with, whether it's like dance and theater, and try and sing. Or if you're comfortable with writing and theater, then try and dance, or whatever it might be. Try something else. Paulo Coelho would say, just go into a puddle and draw stuff in a puddle of water so it disappears really quickly, and just keep doing it just for no reason whatsoever. Just there's no risk involved. You're just doing stuff. That's how you get over creative blocks, is to practice some other form of expression. And then it cracks you open, and then you can go back to the one that you're really comfortable with to get it all down if you like to, or you can continue with that art form. And I think I've rambled for another 20 minutes, yeah? We might have a break. The bar's serving kombucha and coffee and teas and whatnot. There's fruit available here. We'll make it maybe 10 or 15 minutes max. If you can get back to your seats in 10, then we'll start again in 15. Bathrooms are back there. If you'd like to have a cigarette, there's a balcony out to the left. And if we can reconvene in 10 minutes, that'll be fantastic. Thank you.